ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that I must begin with Drew, because everything seems to orbit around his fragile state. For weeks, perhaps longer in story time than we care to admit, he has been reduced to a silent witness trapped in his own body. Now, with Liz stepping in, not dramatically, not heroically in the loud sense, but carefully, almost tenderly, I believe we are seeing the beginning of his return. And I ask myself, what does it truly mean for a man like Drew to wake up? Is it simply about regaining speech, or is it about reclaiming agency in a world that has already moved on without him? I would argue the latter. The subtle cues, the eye movements, the medical suggestions Liz proposes, these are not just plot devices, they are the groundwork for a moral reckoning. Yet here is where I find myself unsettled, perhaps even troubled. If Drew does regain his voice, will it matter? In the past, truth in Port Charles had weight. It could destroy reputations, end relationships, even bring empires to their knees. But now, I am not so certain, because standing on the other side of that truth is Willow, and Willow is no longer the person many viewers remember. There is something profoundly different in the way Willow carries herself now. As a senator, she does not merely react, she calculates. Her alliance, whether openly acknowledged or quietly constructed, with Brennan and even the shadowy presence of Sidwell, signals a transformation that I find both fascinating and deeply unsettling. I have seen ambitious characters before. This show has never lacked them. But Willow's evolution feels different. It is not driven by greed in the traditional sense. It feels more like a belief, perhaps misguided, that she alone can control chaos if she holds enough power. But can anyone truly control chaos in Port Charles? History tells us no, and yet the current writing seems to challenge that assumption. Willow is building something resembling a protective wall around herself, reinforced by influence, information, and alliances that stretch beyond the usual boundaries. I cannot help but wonder, is she protecting herself? Or is she imprisoning herself within a system she will no longer be able to escape? Then comes the most compelling contradiction of all. Drew may awaken. Drew may remember. Drew may even try to expose everything. But what if he fails not because he lacks evidence, but because the world he is waking into no longer values the truth the way it once did? That, to me, is the real tragedy being constructed here. Not revenge denied, but justice rendered irrelevant. I find myself asking a difficult question. Has General Hospital entered a phase where power outweighs morality entirely? If Willow, backed by figures like Brennan, and shielded directly or indirectly by someone as dangerous as Sidwell, can withstand the truth, then Drew's journey becomes something far more painful than a simple comeback story. It becomes a study in futility. And yet, I do not believe the story is without hope. In fact, the hope lies precisely in the tension we are feeling now. Liz's role, for instance, should not be underestimated. She represents something that this show has always needed: quiet integrity. She does not command power like Willow, nor does she manipulate systems like Brennan, but she observes, she understands, and most importantly, she cares. If Drew is to find any footing at all, it will likely be through her persistence rather than his own strength. Still, there is an emotional undercurrent here that I cannot ignore. If Drew cannot take revenge, if he cannot even meaningfully confront Willow, what becomes of him? Does he fade into irrelevance, or does he transform into something else entirely, someone who no longer seeks justice but instead seeks peace? That would be a bold direction, and one that longtime viewers like myself might find both frustrating and strangely satisfying. Because at my age, I have come to understand that not every battle is meant to be won. Some are meant to reveal who we are when victory is no longer possible. And so I watch not with impatience, but with a kind of quiet anticipation. The shock that is building is not explosive in the traditional sense. It is slow, deliberate, and perhaps more dangerous because of it. Willow's rise, Drew's uncertain return, the tightening web of alliances, these are not isolated developments. They are threads in a larger tapestry that is beginning to suggest a fundamental shift in the show's identity. Will Drew lose everything? It certainly seems possible. Will Willow continue to rise unchecked? That, too, feels within reach. But the real question, the one that keeps me watching after all these years, is this. When the dust settles, who will still recognize themselves in the mirror? I do not yet have the answer, but I can feel quite strongly that whatever comes next will not simply entertain us, it will challenge us. And for a viewer who has spent decades with these characters, that is perhaps the most compelling reason of all to keep watching. The idea that Liz could become a target, directly or indirectly, marks a turning point. Liz has always been a stabilizing force, someone grounded in care and quiet strength. She doesn't seek power, and perhaps that is precisely why she is vulnerable now. If Willow truly moves against her, it won't just be another rivalry. It will signal that Willow has crossed a line that separates ambition from something far colder. And I find myself asking, would the Willow we once knew ever justify harming Liz? The answer, increasingly, seems to be yes, and that is deeply unsettling. Then there is Drew. The notion that he could be placed under house arrest, not for a crime, but under the justification of psychological instability, introduces a very different kind of conflict. This is not about physical weakness anymore. It is about credibility. If Drew wakes up and tries to speak, but the world has already been told he cannot be trusted, then his voice becomes meaningless before it is even heard. That is a far more devastating form of silence than anything caused by his medical condition. And here's where the writing becomes particularly sharp. Because on paper, Drew recovers. He wakes up. He remembers. He wants to act. But in reality, he has already lost everything that matters: his agency, his influence, even the belief others might have in him. It creates a haunting contradiction. What does it mean to come back when there is nothing left to return to? Meanwhile, Willow's position only grows stronger. As a senator, she is not just another player in Port Charles. She is becoming the structure itself, shaping outcomes before they even unfold. With figures like Brennan operating in her orbit and the looming presence of Sidwell reinforcing her reach, her empire no longer feels metaphorical. It feels operational, deliberate, and increasingly untouchable. What strikes me most is not just that Willow is winning, but how she is winning. She is not reacting to threats. She is neutralizing them before they fully form. If Liz becomes a target, it is because Liz represents a path back to truth for Drew. If Drew is labeled unstable, it is because his credibility is more dangerous than any evidence he might produce. This is strategy, not impulse, and that makes it far more dangerous than the typical soap villainy we've seen before. So where does that leave us? Drew awakens, yet cannot act. Liz tries to help, yet becomes endangered. Willow rises, yet grows more isolated within her own constructed power. It creates a kind of emotional pressure that feels almost suffocating because there is no immediate release, no clear path to justice. I find myself wondering if this is the point the story is trying to make, that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not defeat, but irrelevance. Drew may not get his revenge not because he lacks the will, but because the system around him has already decided he does not matter. And that is a much darker outcome than any dramatic confrontation. At the same time, I cannot shake the feeling that this empire Willow is building carries the seeds of its own collapse. Power gained through control and silence has a way of demanding more of both, until eventually something breaks. The question is not if that breaking point will come, but who will still be standing when it does. For now, Everything feels like it is moving further and further away from resolution, and that distance is what creates the tension. The story is not rushing to a climax. It is tightening slowly, deliberately. And for viewers like me, that slow burn is both the most compelling and the most unsettling part of all. Because we are no longer just watching events unfold, we are watching a reality take shape in which truth may no longer be enough.